Hey folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and I get a lot of people asking me to make a Warden. So I'm gonna do that. Now, as with most of my sculptures, I'm gonna start with an armature, since an armature is basically the bones of my model, and bones go on the inside, and I find it's easiest to put bones inside at the start, rather than try and stick them in afterwards. Now with my bones in place and in an appropriately Warden-y stance, I can start to bulk out the body. This is bog standard aluminium foil that you can find on offer at the shops, or for my American viewers, this is just plain old aluminum foil that you can find on sale at the store. Otherwise, once I've bulked out my body, I can start adding the clay. I'll start by covering the shiny burrito armor in a thin layer of clay. Now, I'm not worried about proportions or shape at all yet, since I'm only interested in getting clay on the aluminium, so I have a nice sticky surface to build off of. Then, once I've got the clay in place, I'll change my mind on how I want the Warden to look, and I'll cut both his arms off. Now that he's lost his Second Amendment rights, I can get to work creating his oversized belly button. I think the Warden's most distinguishing feature is his oversized chest cavity filled with screaming, glowing faces, so I'm going to treat that as the central point for this sculpture and kind of build the rest of his features around it. Now, I actually spent quite a while trying to get the shape of his chest cavity figured out, but I cut the majority of the footage out of this video in the hopes that I could keep the Rule 34 enthusiasts from running amok in the comments section. Instead, I'm going to do what I feel has been missing from the last few North of the Border videos: needlessly long shots of a butt being sculpted. I wanted to make this Warden realistic in a Minecraft kind of a way, so his head will start out as a pretty blocky block, then I can cut a big hole for its mouth, give it a big pouty upside down smile, and then stick it onto the body. Then I'll give it a slightly inquisitive tilt before adding some face melting into points kind of teeth. The Warden hasn't really got a whole lot of facial detail, and I really like that. I think it's a bold design choice, and I think I'm really brave for sticking with it, since it means that I don't have to make eyes or a nose or even real teeth. And I think I deserve praise for maintaining artistic integrity at the cost of not having to do any extra work. Now, there's not a lot of information on what a Warden is, but I like to think that it's sort of a rotting collection of various unfortunate animals and adventurers that never escape the deep dark. To that end, I wanted my Warden to look kind of like a collection of body parts held together by sinew and tendons, so to help create that texture, I'll run varying sizes of ball styluses along the body, adding little grooves and droopy bits as I go. Otherwise, with his belly button looking extra droopy, I can start to add his ribs. Again, sticking to that original design, the Warden in game only has 8 visible ribs, so my Warden only has 8 visible ribs as well. As with all the best designs, his legs end in blocky stumps, but I'm gonna zhuzh them up a little bit by adding some spiky claws at the bottom. And it's just a case of continuing that sinewy texture all the way up the rest of his body, and then I'm ready to stab some lengths of armature wire into his shoulders so that I can start making his arms. Now, the reason I cut the original arm armatures off was that I thought it would be kind of cool if instead of a bony armor around his biceps, what if instead he had exposed bones for biceps? Boneceps, if you will. To make my dream a reality, I'll make a single armature-filled bonecep where his bicep would be, then build up an initial layer of upper and lower arm around it. Then I can stick some pre-baked bones into the initial arm layer, and then cover that up so that it looks like he's got big muscly arms held together by a motley collection of random arm bones he just kind of found lying around. Once I had bulked up his delts a bit though, I thought they looked a little too normal, so I took some extra ribs I had left over and stuck them in such a way that it kinda looks like the extra bones are jutting up and through his shoulders. Finally, I've been leaning into the droopy, hanging skin kind of a look in his mouth and chest cavity, so I added some of those to his arms. Otherwise, one of the last things I need to do then is give him some hands. To make his hands, I'll start out with a little ball of clay that I'll smoosh flat, then snip a set of 3 fingers into. A little pinch and roll action gives me some creepy fingers, and a bit more of that ball stylus rolly action, a thumb, and a bunch of gnarly knuckles later, and I've got a fairly convincing monster hand ready to be stuck onto my Warden. Then I can add a few blobs of clay around the wrist to help blend the hand into the forearm, and he's got his arms back, which means all that's left to do is give him a double-side lobotomy. This will allow me to stick a couple lengths of wire into place so that I can add his spooky horns. However, I've got something exciting for his horns. This is more of that glow-in-the-dark clay that I used to make my Oogie Blue-gie, but this stuff is blue. I'll add it around the armature horns, working it into pointy tips before coming back with some little blobs to give it more of that droopy, saggy texture that makes up the rest of the Warden. Otherwise, with the glow-in-the-dark droopy horns attached, my Warden is finished and ready for painting. Now I primed the Warden white to make lighter colors easier to apply with fewer coats, which ended up being a total waste of time and primer since I'm going to paint him with predominantly dark blue. To give his horns a tiny bit of gradient, I'm going to use my airbrush and give a very light dusting of transparent blue which shouldn't affect the clay's glow-in-the-dark properties. Then I'll carry this blue across the rest of the Warden to add strategically placed blue to black gradients, trying to stick as close to that original design color scheme as I could be bothered, which in hindsight wasn't very much. Finally, to make all the white bones look like less white bones, I'll paint them all with a bone white. Now with the painting done, the only thing left to do is fill in the Warden's big chest cavity. And to do that, I've made a set of non-descriptive screaming faces out of the glow-in-the-dark clay, which I can then mount on an acrylic rod and glue into place into the cavity in such a way that it looks like the Warden has the worst case of heartburn ever. I also realized that once I glued the faces in place, I meant to paint their eyes and mouths black, so I'll awkwardly try and do that now. Otherwise, with the faces in place, I can fill in the rest of the space with a little resin. Once I started mixing my resin, I was struck with a moment of clarity and remembered that I have a little bit of glow-in-the-dark pigment which, when added to the resin, will make it glow-in-the-dark as well. Finally, I can pour my resin into my chest cavity and set my Warden aside to cure. Now, while he's curing, I may as well make a Steve. Now, if Steve's going to be meeting a Warden, then he's going to be deep underground, which means he's going to need a torch. And to make my torch, I'm going to use one of these non-flame tea lights since they've got a perfect little flickering LED inside. Once I've freed the LED of its fiery silicone and plastic prison, I'll make a new prison out of a little block of clay. This will be Steve's torch, so to fit the LED and wiring inside, I'll cut a little channel down the middle, then fit the wiring in and cover it with a little bit more clay. The top I'll cover with a little blob of translucent clay, then once it's been cured, I can sand the sides down flat until it looks pretty close to a little Minecraft torch. Now with my tiny torch finished, I can get to work on the torchbearer himself. To make things harder than they need to be, I'm going to work in sections before realizing I should have just made the entire armature at once. Sometimes I like to challenge myself by being an idiot and doing things the hard way. To that end, I'm going to start by making just his upper body so that I don't have anything to hold on to while I sculpt the details. Fortunately, as far as details are concerned, I'm going with a what if Steve were only slightly realistic interpretation, with the end result hopefully being a very blocky, but still slightly human-looking version. I've already done the I made Steve but he's realistic, so this time I'm going to do a bit more of a conservative take on the realistic Minecraft man. Basically, I want his arms and legs to mostly be straight and blocky, and his head's still going to be a cube, but I want to give the surface details a bit more attention. However, before I get to the rest of the details, I need to make Steve a sword. And not just any sword, a diamond sword. And don't worry about the rough edges, I'm gonna fix those up by having the rest of the video be out of focus. Now with Steve somewhat more prepared for his foray into the deep dark, I can get to work adding the rest of his upper body details. I've also smartened up a little bit and given him some temporary leg bones so that he has something to stand on. I considered giving Steve a full set of armor so that he's at least somewhat prepared beyond the torch and sword, but I'm a sucker for the original blue jeans and slightly untucked t-shirt look, so that's what I ended up going with. Otherwise, once I've got my blocky upper body looking pretty good, I can get to work adding his legs, and as I'd mentioned before, I'm gonna stick with the blocky rectangle style. I've also run the wiring along one of his legs and out the bottom of his shoe so that when it passes through the ground and into the battery pack below, it should completely hide any of the exposed wiring. Much like the Warden, Steve's head starts as a cube, but instead of an oversized droopy tooth mouth, I'm gonna try and take my time here and bake as much detail into this part of the body as I can. I'll give him a big strong jaw, oversized expressive caterpillar eyebrows, and a half smile, half grimace, rounded by big smile lines. Then I'll give him a big blocky nose, then using a nylon brush, I'll jab his face a bunch to give him his trademark Steve stubble. Then a couple hearing holes on the side of his head, and I can add the final piece of the head puzzle, which is his hair. Now I'm cutting it short here so that it lines up with the more traditional Steve aesthetic, but if you think I didn't giggle at the idea of giving Steve a mullet, then you clearly don't know me. Last but not least, to help break up the flatness of his shirt, a few strategically placed wormy dealies will add some wrinkles, and then I'll untuck the corner of his shirt. And with that, Steve is finished and ready for some color. While last time I primed the Warden before using dark colors, this time I'm going to not prime and then use light colors, because reasons. As long as you're using acrylics, you really shouldn't have any issues with painting directly over the clay, and some of the primers that I use are a light gray anyways, so they really wouldn't make much of a difference. Also, for me, painting is a means to an end, and it's very much a necessary evil when it comes to these projects, so the fewer steps that I have to involve in the process, the better. That being said, as far as painting is concerned, Steve's a pretty good one to have to do. He's got a lot of blues and browns, and the majority of his finer details are done just using straight lines. Now with the larger sections painted, I can get to work on the smaller details of his face. The eyes get a simple white with purple pupils, while his teeth get an even simpler white with a black line down the middle to accentuate his concerned terror smile. Then I'll paint his torch brown, making sure not to paint over the translucent clay on top, and his sword gets a series of light blues, dark blues, and aquamarines. Finally, Steve is finished and it's time to make the deep dark cave. And to make said cave, I'm gonna use this thing. This is a hot wire table and it's equal parts terrifying and heckin' neat. It works by heating up a tiny strip of wire that then cuts through extra thick sheets of foam like a hot wire through foam. The beauty of this thing compared to a knife though is that I get to trade the possibility of cutting myself with the possibility of both burning myself and giving myself lung cancer. It does, however, make some pretty perfect base-ready cave cubes ready to be texturized. Normally I'm all about that rocky texture, but rocks tend to leave a bit too deep an imprint and I have a tendency to go a bit ham with them, which leaves me with a pretty gnarly looking edge by the end. I want all these blocks to line up neatly though, so a little ball of aluminium will work just as well. Also, what's okay without some stalagmites, so I'll cut myself some slightly wonky, slightly blocky pyramids, and then carve them into somewhat stalagmite-y shapes. Then they get a little bit of that aluminium ball texturing, and I can start gluing all my pieces together. Now once the glue's had time to set, I'll give the entire base a protective layer of black paint and Mod Podge. This will both prime the base black and help the paint adhere to the foam. Of course, the deep dark is kinda dark, so there isn't a whole lot that needs to be done to the base. However, to add a bit of color variation, I'll tickle the tips of the blocks with a light blue dry brush, while the stalagmites get a light gray instead. Additionally, the deep dark is full of sculpt blocks which have lots of little glow-in-the-dark spots, which is perfect since I happen to have made a whole bunch of tiny glow-in-the-dark squares. And to make things a bit more interesting and cave-like, I made a bunch of glow-in-the-dark mushrooms as well. Finally, to make the squares a bit more blue when the lights are on, I'll hit them all with a blast of the same translucent blue that I used on the Warden. Then I can drill a little hole through the front of the base so that I can feed Steve's wires through, glue them in place, then connect the wires to a battery pack. Then I'll glue the battery pack to the underside in a little hollow I carved out earlier, flip the whole thing upright, drop the Warden in place, and we're finished here and on to the Glamour Shots. As always, a massive thank you to the patrons over on Patreon, and a very special shout out to my newest patrons, iRoll and Sai, Ari Fox, Bex Mini Studio, Kyle and Sally, TTT, Diverse Photography, Guru, Josue Carrillo, Jared Williamson, Propanux, Matt Blacketer, Kieran Burton, Sightkeeper, Caitlin E, Hello Owen and Nora, Vincent Scafudo, Heather Doyle, Pyotr Krzysztof Fedorovich, Alyssa, Rita and Zach, Kirsten Bish, Aaron Morelli, Bennett, Minix, Grimy Fresh, Caden Estrada and Grav, Brandon Grenier, Stephanie, Sam I Am, and the Hollivers. You are the bioluminescent blue cubes that keep this channel visible in the dark. Keep hitting me with more ideas down below in the comments, and who knows, maybe one of these days I'll cave and give you people what you actually want instead of horrible realistic versions of your childhood memories. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.